The rain was coming down in sheets that November evening when Marcus pulled up to the Maple Street bus stop and told me to get out. Not asked. Told. As if I were some stranger he'd given a courtesy ride to, rather than his wife of 8 years. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically as he kept the engine running, his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet my gaze. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I can't do this anymore, Emma, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Victoria's waiting for me at the restaurant. We have important things to discuss about our future. I sat there in the passenger seat, raindrops already starting to seep through the slightly open window, trying to process what was happening. Victoria Sterling, his colleague from Sterling and Associates, the woman he'd been mentioning more and more frequently over the past few months. The woman he claimed was just a work friend, whenever I asked about their late-night strategy sessions and weekend conferences. "You're leaving me at a bus stop?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the rain hammering against the car roof. Marcus finally turned to look at me, and for a moment, I saw something that looked almost like guilt flicker across his features. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold determination. "It's better this way. Clean break. No messy scenes at home." I reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, my mind struggling to accept that this was really happening. 8 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. Not with a conversation, not with counseling or attempts to work things out, but with me being deposited at a bus stop like unwanted cargo. "My things," I started to say, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "I'll have them packed and sent wherever you end up. Helen's already started clearing out your closet space. She never really thought you were right for our family anyway." The mention of his mother hit like another slap. Helen Thompson had made her disapproval of me clear from day one, constantly, making subtle comments about my background, my job, my inability to give Marcus the social connections she felt he deserved. Apparently, she'd finally gotten her wish. I stepped out into the downpour, immediately soaked to the skin despite my thin jacket. The bus stop's shelter was minimal, barely more than a piece of plexiglass that did nothing to protect against the wind-driven rain. I turned back toward the car, thinking maybe Marcus would change his mind. Maybe he'd realize how cruel this was. Instead, I watched his taillights disappear into the November darkness, leaving me alone under the flickering streetlight with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. Standing there in the rain, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete and utter abandonment. The kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes until you can barely breathe. But as the water dripped from my hair and ran down my face, mixing with tears I didn't even realize I was crying, something else began to stir. A memory I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. 20 minutes passed before the number 47 bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the rain like salvation. The doors wheezed open with a mechanical sigh, and I climbed aboard, fishing in my purse for the exact change. The driver, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, took one look at my dripping state and waved away my money. "Rough night, honey?" she asked as I made my way toward a seat near the front. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady if I tried to speak. The bus was nearly empty except for an elderly man in a worn coat near the back and a young woman with earbuds who was staring out the window at the passing lights. I chose a seat and wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shivering that had less to do with the cold and more to do with shock. The bus pulled away from the curb with a diesel rumble, and I watched the familiar neighborhoods of Cedar Falls pass by through rain-streaked windows. These were routes I knew well from my previous job as a transportation logistics coordinator. Back before Marcus convinced me that his rising career meant I should focus on supporting our household, rather than pursuing my own ambitions. That had been 3 years ago, when he got promoted to regional sales manager, and started talking about image and appearances, and how important it was for a man in his position to have a wife who could focus on their social obligations. I'd been stupid enough to believe him, stupid enough to think that love meant sacrifice, that supporting your partner meant giving up your own dreams. Now I realized what I'd really been doing was making myself completely dependent on someone who saw me as disposable. The bus driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea. Our house was in Riverside Heights, but Marcus had made it clear that wasn't an option. I had a few friends, but most of them were couples we'd socialized with together, and asking them to choose sides felt impossible in my current state. My parents had passed away 5 years ago, and I'd lost touch with most of my old colleagues after leaving my job. "I'm not sure," I admitted, my voice sounding small and lost. The driver, whose name tag read Rosa Martinez, gave me a sympathetic smile. "Well, we've got a few more stops before the depot. Maybe something will come to you." As the bus continued its route through downtown Cedar Falls, I found myself really looking at the city for the first time in years. The transit system had expanded significantly since I'd worked in logistics. New routes, updated buses, digital displays at major stops showing real-time arrival information. Someone had invested serious money in modernizing the entire network. That's when I noticed the elderly man from the back of the bus had moved closer. He was sitting across the aisle now, and I could see he was wearing a faded Metro Transit Authority jacket over his civilian clothes. His face was weathered, but kind, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "Excuse me, miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of speaking over engine noise. "I couldn't help but notice you seem a bit lost. I'm George Watkins, been driving for Metro Transit for 42 years. Retired now, but old habits die hard. I still ride the routes sometimes, keep an eye on how things are running." I managed a weak smile. Emma Chen. "And yes, I suppose I am pretty lost right now." George nodded understandingly. "Been there myself. Sometimes life throws you a curveball that knocks you right off your feet. But I've found that when one door closes, sometimes you discover there were other doors you didn't even know existed." Something about his manner reminded me of my grandfather, who'd passed away when I was in college. The same gentle wisdom, the same way of speaking that made you feel like whatever you were going through, you weren't facing it alone. "You said you worked for Metro Transit?" I asked, partly to distract myself from my current situation, and partly because something about the conversation was stirring that buried memory again. 42 years, George repeated with pride. "Started as a mechanic, worked my way up to operations supervisor before I retired. Seen this whole system grow from a dozen old buses to what it is today. Course, the real changes started happening about 15 years ago when the ownership structure shifted." "Ownership structure?" George's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved talking about his work. "Oh yes, most folks don't realize it, but Metro Transit Authority isn't actually city-owned anymore. Got bought out by a private investment group back in 2009. Smart move, really. The city was going bankrupt trying to maintain the system, but the new owners had deep pockets and long-term vision. The buried memory was getting stronger now, clawing its way to the surface despite years of deliberate suppression. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to think clearly through the emotional fog of the evening's events. "Investment group," I repeated slowly. "Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings," George continued. "Interesting company, very quiet about their operations, but they've poured millions into infrastructure improvements. New buses, route expansion, digital systems, employee benefits. Some of the best working conditions I've seen in 4 decades of transit work." Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings. The name hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I wasn't sitting on a city bus anymore. I was 25 years old again, sitting in a lawyer's office in Portland, staring at documents I didn't understand while a stern-faced man in an expensive suit explained my inheritance. My grandfather, Chen Wei-ming, had been what people politely called eccentric, a Chinese immigrant who'd built a small fortune through a series of seemingly random investments that somehow always paid off. Tech stocks before anyone knew what the internet was, real estate in neighborhoods that gentrified 20 years later, and transportation companies. Lots and lots of transportation companies. When he died, he'd left everything to me with one condition. I couldn't touch the principal until I turned 35, and I couldn't sell any of the holdings until I was 40. Until then, I'd receive a modest monthly allowance that was enough to live on, but not enough to live extravagantly. At 25, facing the prospect of waiting 10 years to access real money, I'd been frustrated and resentful. I wanted to pay off my student loans immediately, maybe buy a house, live like the wealthy heiress I technically was. But my grandfather's lawyer had been inflexible. The trust was ironclad, designed to ensure I learned the value of work and independence before inheriting what he'd built. So I'd taken my monthly stipend, gotten a job in transportation logistics because it felt somehow connected to his legacy, and tried to forget about the fortune I couldn't touch. When I met Marcus 3 years later, I'd mentioned the inheritance, in vague terms, but he'd been more interested in my immediate earning potential than some distant windfall that might or might not materialize. After we married, he'd gradually convinced me that depending on family money was unseemly, that we should build our life together based on what we could earn ourselves. I'd been so in love, so eager to prove that I was with him for the right reasons, that I'd barely thought about my grandfather's companies for years. "Miss? You all right?" George's concerned voice brought me back to the present. I realized I'd been staring at him in shock for several long moments. "Pacific Northwest. Transportation Holdings," I said carefully. "Do you know anything about the ownership structure? Who actually runs the company?" George tilted his head, studying me with new interest. "Well, that's the funny thing. It's all managed through some kind of trust arrangement. Very private. Very professional. We get directives and funding approvals, but I never met anyone from the actual ownership side. Always worked through lawyers and management companies." The bus was pulling into the downtown transit hub now, and Rosa called back to us. "End of the line, folks. Last bus out is in 20 minutes if anyone needs a connection." I stood up, slowly, my mind racing. If what George was saying was true, if Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings really owned the Metro Transit Authority, then I needed to find out exactly what that meant for me. Because unless I was very much mistaken, I just turned 35 last month. "George," I said as we prepared to exit the bus, "hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to find out more about Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings, where would they start?" He considered the question seriously. "Well, there's always the corporate records office downtown. Public filings, board of directors, that sort of thing. Though with private companies, there's not always much to find." He paused, then added, "Course, if someone really wanted to dig deep, they'd probably need a good corporate lawyer, someone who specializes in trust and estate law." As we stepped off the bus into the still pouring rain, I felt something shift inside me. The helpless, abandoned woman who'd been dumped at a bus stop an hour ago was still there, but she was sharing space with someone else now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Someone who was starting to remember that she wasn't as powerless as she'd been led to believe. "George," I said impulsively, "would you like to get a cup of coffee? There's a diner across the street that should still be open, and I'd love to hear more about how the transit system works." His weathered face broke into a surprised smile. "Well, I don't see why not. Been a long time since someone wanted to hear an old transit worker ramble about buses and schedules." As we hurried across the street through the rain toward the warm day lights of Sunset Diner, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Catherine Rodriguez had been my grandfather's lawyer, and later the executor of his estate. We'd spoken briefly on my birthday when she'd called to inform me that certain restrictions on my inheritance would be lifting soon, but I'd been so focused on Marcus and our anniversary dinner plans that I'd barely paid attention. Now, I had a feeling that conversation was going to be much more important than I'd realized. The diner was exactly the kind of place that looked like it had been serving coffee and comfort food to night shift workers and insomniacs for decades. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a waitress who didn't bat an eye at two people dripping rainwater onto her clean floors at nearly midnight. George slid into the booth across from me and ordered black coffee. I asked for the same, though what I really needed was something much stronger. As the waitress walked away, I studied this man who'd appeared in my life at exactly the moment I needed him. In the bright diner lights, I could see that his transit authority jacket was well maintained despite its age, and his demeanor suggested someone who'd spent decades solving problems and helping people navigate difficult situations. "George," I said carefully, "what do you know about corporate takeovers in the transit industry? Specifically, what happens when a private company acquires a public system?" He raised an eyebrow but didn't seem particularly surprised by the question. "Happens more often than people think. Cities run out of money to maintain their transit systems. Private companies step in with capital and expertise. Sometimes it works out well for everyone involved, sometimes not so much. Depends on who's running the show and what their priorities are." And in Metro Transit's case? Like I said, we've been lucky. Whoever's behind Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings seems to actually care about providing good service. We've seen budget increases, infrastructure improvements, better working conditions for drivers and mechanics. That's not always the case when private equity gets involved in public services. The waitress returned with our coffee, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, trying to organize my thoughts. "George, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. If someone theoretically had some kind of ownership stake in the transit system, what kind of power would that give them?" George's sharp blue eyes studied me intently over his coffee cup. "Well, theoretically speaking, if someone owned a controlling interest in Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings, they'd essentially own the entire Metro Transit Authority. Routes, schedules, hiring and firing, contracts with the city, everything." "Everything?" "Everything! They could shut down routes, change schedules, even terminate the whole system's contract with the city if they wanted to. Of course, there'd be legal ramifications and public backlash, but from a purely business standpoint, yeah, the owner calls the shots." I set my coffee cup down with shaking hands. "And if someone wanted to make changes to personnel? Say, if they discovered that certain employees were being mistreated or taken advantage of? The owner could certainly investigate that, make changes to management, review employee complaints, that sort of thing. We've got a pretty good union, but the ownership has the final say on most operational decisions." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Catherine Rodriguez's contact information. "George, I hope you don't mind, but I need to make a phone call. It might take a few minutes." He nodded understandingly. "Take your time. I'll just sit here and enjoy my coffee. Been a while since I had a conversation this interesting." I stepped outside onto the covered porch of the diner, where I could hear better despite the ongoing rain. Catherine answered on the second ring, sounding remarkably alert for someone being called close to midnight. "Emma, is everything all right? It's quite late." "Catherine, I need to ask you about my inheritance, specifically about Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I see. I was wondering when you'd start asking about the individual holdings." "Yes, Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings is one of your grandfather's companies. In fact, it's one of the larger ones." "How large?" "You own it entirely. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chen Family Trust, which you now control. Your grandfather acquired the transit contracts about 15 years ago, when several municipal systems were facing bankruptcy. He saw it as a stable, recession-proof investment with the potential for steady growth. I had to sit down on one of the diner's porch chairs. Catherine, are you telling me I own the Metro Transit Authority? Yes, along with similar systems in 6 other cities across Oregon and Washington. The portfolio also includes several freight and logistics companies, but the municipal transit contracts are probably the most visible assets. And I can make operational decisions? As of last month, when you turned 35, you have full operational control. The trust restrictions have been lifted. You can hire and fire management, change routes, modify contracts, whatever you deem necessary for the efficient operation of your companies. I stared out at the rain-soaked street, watching the occasional car pass by, their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. An hour ago, I'd been a powerless woman abandoned at a bus stop. Now I was apparently the owner of the entire transit system that had rescued me. Catherine, I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. There are some changes I'd like to make. Of course. My office at 9? Perfect. And Catherine? This needs to be completely confidential for now. I'll explain everything when I see you. After ending the call, I stood on the porch for a few more minutes, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Marcus had left me at a bus stop, assuming I was helpless and dependent. He'd calculated that without him, I had nowhere to go and no resources to rebuild my life. He'd been spectacularly wrong. When I returned to the booth, George looked up expectantly. Good news, I hope? Very good news, I said, unable to keep a smile from spreading across my face. George, how would you feel about coming out of retirement for a consulting position? I have a feeling I'm going to need someone with your experience and institutional knowledge. Consulting on what? I leaned forward, my voice low but determined. On how to run a transit system properly, and on identifying anyone in the organization who might not be treating employees with the respect they deserve. George's eyes widened slightly, and then a slow grin spread across his weathered features. Well, now, that sounds like it might be quite an adventure. When do we start? Tomorrow morning. And George? I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something very satisfying indeed. As we finished our coffee and prepared to brave the rain again, I felt a transformation taking place that went far deeper than just discovering my hidden assets. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not Marcus's wife, not Helen's disappointing daughter-in-law, but Emma Chen, granddaughter of a brilliant investor who'd taught me that the best revenge was living well, and that sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all, the element of surprise. Marcus thought he'd left me with nothing. Tomorrow, he was going to discover just how wrong he'd been. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, typical November weather for Cedar Falls. I'd spent the night at the Grandview Apartments, a modest extended-stay hotel downtown that George had recommended. The room was clean but basic, a far cry from the spacious home in Riverside Heights that I'd shared with Marcus for the past 5 years. But as I stood at the window watching the early morning commuters hurrying to catch their buses, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete autonomy. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since 6 a.m. with calls from Marcus. I'd let every single one go to voicemail. Whatever panic or guilt had set in after he'd had time to think about dumping his wife at a bus stop in the rain, I wasn't ready to hear it. Besides, I had more important things to focus on. At 8:30, I walked the 6 blocks to Catherine Rodriguez's law office, located in a stately brick building that housed several of Cedar Falls' most prestigious firms. Catherine had been my grandfather's attorney for over 20 years, and she'd handled his estate with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made his unconventional investment strategies so successful. Her office hadn't changed much since I'd last visited 5 years ago. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes, and a massive mahogany desk that had probably cost more than most people's cars. Catherine herself was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel think twice before challenging her in court. "Emma," she said, rising from behind her desk to embrace me warmly. "You look tired, dear. I hope everything is all right." I settled into one of the leather chairs across from her desk. "That's what I'm here to discuss. Catherine, I need to understand exactly what I inherited from my grandfather. Not just the broad strokes, but the specific details of how these companies operate." Catherine opened a thick file folder that had been waiting on her desk. "I was hoping you'd eventually ask for a comprehensive briefing. Your grandfather built quite an empire, though he was always very discreet about it. Pacific Northwest. Transportation Holdings is actually just one division of Chen Family Enterprises." She spread several documents across the desk. "The transportation division includes Metro Transit Authority here in Cedar Falls, similar contracts in Portland, Eugene, Salem, Tacoma, and Spokane. The freight division handles logistics for several major retailers. There's also a significant real estate portfolio and a venture capital fund that focuses on sustainable transportation technology." I stared at the numbers on the financial statements. "Catherine, these revenue figures can't be right." "Oh, they're quite accurate. Your grandfather was particularly gifted at identifying undervalued assets in essential services. Transportation, utilities, communications infrastructure. Things people need regardless of economic conditions." She pointed to a specific line item. "The Metro Transit Authority alone generates about $40 million annually in revenue from city contracts, advertising, and federal transit grants. And I control all of this? As of your 35th birthday, yes. The trust restrictions have been lifted completely. You can hire and fire executives, change operational policies, enter into new contracts, sell assets if you choose. Your grandfather designed the trust to ensure you'd be mature enough to handle the responsibility, but he always intended for you to have complete control eventually." I thought about Marcus's reaction when I'd mentioned my inheritance over the years. He'd always dismissed it as family money that might or might not amount to anything significant. The irony was bitter. While he'd been climbing the corporate ladder at Sterling & Associates, desperately trying to impress clients and build his reputation, I'd been sitting on a business empire that dwarfed his entire company. "Catherine, I need to know about the current management structure at Metro Transit. Who's running the day-to-day operations?" She flipped through several pages. "The general manager is a man named Richard Hoffman. He's been in the position for 8 years, hired by the previous management company your grandfather contracted to oversee operations. There's also a deputy manager, several department heads, and a full administrative staff. Have there been any employee complaints? Issues? With management practices?" Catherine's expression grew more serious. "That's an interesting question. There have been a few grievances filed through the union over the past year. Nothing that reached the level of requiring legal intervention, but some concerns about favoritism in scheduling, unequal treatment of drivers, that sort of thing." "What kind of unequal treatment?" "Let me pull the file." Catherine retrieved another folder from a filing cabinet. "There was a complaint filed 6 months ago by a driver named Patricia Wells. She alleged that her supervisor was giving preferential routes and overtime opportunities to drivers who were willing to provide personal favors." I felt a chill of recognition. What kind of personal favors? The complaint was somewhat vague, but it suggested that certain drivers were expected to provide transportation services for management's personal use. Driving family members to events, running errands, that sort of thing. Technically, a misuse of company resources, though not necessarily illegal. "What happened to the complaint?" "It was reviewed by Richard Hoffman and determined to be unfounded. The supervisor in question, a man named David Turner, received a written reprimand for poor communication with his drivers, but no further action was taken." I made a mental note to speak with Patricia Wells directly. Catherine, I want to schedule a meeting with Richard Hoffman for this afternoon. Don't tell him why, just that the ownership group wants to review current operations. Of course. Anything else? Yes. I want you to draft a letter giving me full authority to review all personnel files, financial records, and operational policies. And I want to schedule interviews with the union representatives and any employees who've filed grievances in the past 2 years. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Emma, may I ask what's prompted this sudden interest in the detailed operations of your companies? I stood up and walked to the window overlooking downtown Cedar Falls. From this height, I could see several bus stops and watch the morning rush hour in progress. Somewhere out there, drivers like Rosa Martinez and George Watkins were doing their jobs with professionalism and care, while others might be dealing with supervisors who saw their positions as opportunities for personal gain. Let's just say, I've had a revelation about the importance of treating people with dignity and respect, and about what happens when someone abuses a position of trust. Catherine nodded slowly. I see. Well, you certainly have the authority to make whatever changes you deem necessary. Your grandfather always said that businesses succeed when they treat their employees well and fail when they don't. After leaving Catherine's office, I called George Watkins. He'd given me his number the night before, explaining that retirement hadn't quite taken hold, and he was always available if someone needed advice about transit operations. George, it's Emma. Are you free for lunch? I'd like to discuss that consulting position we talked about. Absolutely. Where would you like to meet? How about Sunset Diner again? I'm starting to think of it as our headquarters. George chuckled. Perfect. I'll see you at noon. I spent the morning walking around downtown Cedar Falls, observing the transit system with new eyes. I watched passengers board buses, paid attention to how drivers interacted with riders, and noted which routes seemed to be running on time, versus which ones were consistently delayed. It was like seeing a business I owned for the first time, which in many ways was exactly what was happening. At one bus stop, I overheard a conversation between two women who were clearly Metro Transit employees based on their uniforms. They were discussing their supervisor with obvious frustration. David's at it again, one of them was saying. Told Jennifer she could have the weekend overtime if she'd drive his mother-in-law to her doctor appointments on Thursday. That's ridiculous. We're not a personal chauffeur service. Try telling him that. Ever since he got promoted, he acts like we work for him personally instead of for the company. I filed the information away and continued my observations. By the time I met George at the diner, I had a growing list of concerns and questions about how my transit system was actually being managed. George was already seated in the same booth we'd occupied the night before, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. He looked up as I approached, and I could see the curiosity in his eyes. So, he said after I'd ordered my own coffee, I've been thinking about our conversation last night. You never did explain exactly what kind of consulting work you had in mind. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. George, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay completely confidential until I say otherwise. Can you give me your word on that? His expression grew serious. You have it. I own Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings, which means I own Metro Transit Authority. George's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully and stared at me for a long moment. You own the whole system? The whole system. And based on what I've been observing this morning, there are some management issues that need to be addressed. I need someone with your experience to help me understand what's really going on and how to fix it. Well, I'll be damned. George shook his head slowly. And here I thought you were just someone having a bad night. You're the mysterious owner we've all been wondering about for years. Mysterious? Oh, yes. We knew the system was privately owned, but nobody ever knew who was actually behind it. Management always said the owners preferred to remain anonymous and let the professionals handle operations. What did you think of that arrangement? George considered the question carefully. Honestly, it worked fine for the first few years. We got better equipment, decent pay raises, improved working conditions. But in the last couple of years, things have started to slide. New management brought in people who seemed more interested in cutting costs and playing favorites than maintaining service quality. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard at the bus stop. George, tell me about David Turner. His expression darkened immediately. David Turner is exactly the kind of supervisor who gives the whole industry a bad name. Got promoted about 18 months ago when his predecessor retired, and he's been abusing his position ever since. How so? Uses company drivers for personal errands, plays favorites with scheduling and overtime assignments, makes inappropriate comments to female employees. I heard from several drivers that he's been pretty explicit about what kind of extra duties might lead to better assignments. I felt a familiar surge of anger. And management hasn't done anything about it? There have been complaints, but Richard Hoffman seems to think Turner's cost-cutting measures outweigh any personnel issues. Plus, Turner's got friends in the administrative office who help cover for him. What kind of friends? His brother-in-law works in HR. His college roommate handles the financial audits. It's become a bit of a boys' club up there, with the rest of us just trying to do our jobs and stay out of their way. I pulled out a notebook and started writing down names and details. George, I'm going to need you to help me document everything. Every instance of misconduct, every employee who's been mistreated, every policy that's been violated. Can you do that? Absolutely. But Emma, you should know that if you start making changes, there's going to be pushback. Turner and his friends aren't going to give up their positions without a fight. Let them fight. I have something they don't. What's that? I actually own the company. George's weathered face broke into a grin. This is going to be interesting. We spent the next 2 hours going over George's knowledge of the system's personnel and operations. He had an encyclopedic memory for details and a clear understanding of who was doing their job properly versus who was taking advantage of their position. By the time we finished, I had a comprehensive picture of a transit system that was fundamentally sound, but being undermined by poor management and a culture of favoritism. There's one more thing you should know, George said as we prepared to leave. Richard Hoffman's been talking about selling some of the newer buses and replacing them with older, cheaper models. Says it's about cost efficiency, but the drivers are concerned about safety and reliability. Has he gotten approval for that? He says he's waiting for authorization from the ownership group, but he's been pressuring the maintenance department to downgrade their recommendations for new equipment. I made another note. Richard Hoffman was clearly operating under the assumption that the anonymous owners would approve any cost-cutting measure that improved short-term profits, regardless of the impact on service quality or employee welfare. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. My meeting with Hoffman was scheduled for 3 o'clock at the Metro Transit Authority building, a modern glass and steel structure that housed the administrative offices and main dispatch center. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time observing the workplace culture. The building's lobby was professional but sterile, with corporate motivational posters and a display case showing awards for safety and efficiency. Several employees passed through while I waited, and I noticed that most of them seemed hurried and stressed, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be management. Richard Hoffman turned out to be exactly what I'd expected based on George's description. A man in his late 40s with perfectly styled hair, an expensive suit, and the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He greeted me in the lobby with the enthusiasm of someone who assumed I was there to approve his cost-cutting initiatives. Ms. Chen, welcome to Metro Transit Authority. I'm Richard Hoffman, General Manager. It's wonderful to finally meet someone from the ownership group in person. I shook his hand politely. Thank you for making time to see me, Mr. Hoffman. I'm here to review our current operations and discuss some potential changes. His smile widened. Excellent. I think you'll be very pleased with what we've accomplished. We've managed to reduce operational costs by 12% over the past 18 months while maintaining service levels. He led me to his office, a spacious room with windows overlooking the main bus depot. The walls were covered with charts and graphs showing various performance metrics, all designed to present the most favorable possible picture of his management. As you can see, Hoffman continued, gesturing to his displays, we've been very successful at streamlining operations, reduced overtime costs, optimized routes for maximum efficiency, and identified several opportunities for additional cost savings. I studied the charts with interest. I noticed passenger satisfaction scores have declined over the same period. What's your analysis of that trend? Hoffman's smile flickered slightly. Well, there's always some adjustment period when you implement efficiency measures. We expect satisfaction scores to improve once passengers adapt to the new schedules and procedures. And employee satisfaction? Our employees understand that everyone needs to do their part to maintain profitability. We've been very clear about expectations and performance standards. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. Mr. Hoffman, I'd like to review some specific personnel matters with you. I understand there have been several employee complaints filed in recent months. His expression became more guarded. Every organization deals with the occasional personnel issue. We have procedures in place to address legitimate concerns while protecting the company from frivolous complaints. Tell me about David Turner. The change in Hoffman's demeanor was immediate and telling. His shoulders tensed, and his smile became distinctly forced. David is one of our most effective supervisors. He's been instrumental in implementing our new efficiency protocols. What about the complaints regarding his treatment of female employees? There was one complaint that was thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. The employee in question was clearly attempting to avoid accountability for her own performance issues. I pulled out my notebook. Patricia Wells? Yes. Ms. Wells has a history of attendance problems and conflicts with authority. When David tried to address these issues through proper channels, she filed a baseless complaint as retaliation. And the allegations that Mr. Turner was requiring drivers to provide personal services for management? Hoffman's laugh sounded forced. I think there may have been some miscommunication about our community outreach programs. Occasionally, our drivers volunteer to help with company-sponsored charitable activities. It's entirely voluntary and reflects well on our corporate citizenship. I made notes as he spoke, paying as much attention to what he wasn't saying as to his actual words. It was clear that Hoffman had no intention of addressing the legitimate concerns about Turner's behavior. In fact, he seemed to be actively protecting Turner while dismissing the employees who'd had the courage to complain. Mr. Hoffman, I'd like to schedule individual meetings with several employees over the next few days. Can you arrange for me to speak privately with Patricia Wells, Rosa Martinez, and the union representatives? Of course, though I should mention that Ms. Wells is currently on probation for performance issues. Her perspective on company policies may not be entirely objective. I'll keep that in mind. What about the proposal to downgrade our bus fleet? Hoffman's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Ah, yes, one of our most promising cost-saving initiatives. We've identified an opportunity to replace 12 of our newer buses with refurbished models that would reduce our capital expenses by nearly $2 million. At what cost to safety and reliability? The refurbished buses meet all federal safety standards and would be perfectly adequate for our routes. The maintenance department has raised some minor concerns about long-term reliability, but those are outweighed by the immediate financial benefits. I closed my notebook and stood up. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hoffman. I'll be in touch about next steps. As I left his office, I could feel him watching me with obvious concern. He'd clearly expected our meeting to result in enthusiastic approval of his management philosophy. Instead, I'd asked pointed questions about employee complaints and challenged his cost-cutting priorities. Walking through the administrative offices on my way out, I noticed several employees who seemed to recognize that something significant was happening. Word would spread quickly that someone from the ownership group was asking uncomfortable questions about management practices. I called Catherine from my car. "I need you to draft termination letters for Richard Hoffman and David Turner, effective immediately. I also want you to prepare announcements for interim management appointments. Emma, are you sure you want to move this quickly? Terminating senior management without a transition plan could disrupt operations." "Catherine, I've spent one day observing this system, and I've already identified serious problems with both employee treatment and operational priorities. Every day these men remain in positions of authority is another day that good employees are being mistreated and the company's reputation is being damaged. All right, who do you want to appoint as interim replacements?" I thought about my conversation with George and the impression I'd gotten of the various employees I'd encountered. "I want to promote Patricia Wells to interim deputy manager and bring George Watkins back as interim general manager. They both understand the system and they have the respect of the employees." "Very well. I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning." As I drove back to my hotel, I felt the same sense of purpose and clarity that had emerged the night before. Marcus had abandoned me because he thought I was powerless and dependent. In reality, he'd freed me to discover just how much power I actually had. But this wasn't just about proving my independence anymore. It was about creating the kind of workplace where people like Rosa Martinez and George Watkins were valued and respected, where employees didn't have to worry about supervisors who abused their authority, and where the focus was on providing excellent service rather than cutting costs at the expense of quality. Tomorrow, the real changes would begin. Thursday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the first break in the week's persistent rain. I woke early in my hotel room at Grandview Apartments, energized by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Today would mark the beginning of real change at Metro Transit Authority, and I intended to make sure those changes sent ripples through every corner of my life. Catherine had called the night before to confirm that all the legal documents were prepared. George had agreed to meet me at 7 a.m. to review our strategy before the day's events unfolded. As I dressed in a sharp navy business suit that I'd purchased the day before, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and realized I looked different. More confident, more determined. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the rain-soaked, abandoned wife from 3 days ago. George was waiting in the hotel lobby, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking like a man who'd gotten the best night's sleep in years. Despite being in his 70s, he had the energy and enthusiasm of someone half his age who'd just been handed the opportunity of a lifetime. "Morning, boss," he said with a grin, handing me one of the coffee cups. "Ready to shake things up?" "More than ready. Did you reach out to Patricia Wells?" "I did. She's nervous but willing to meet with you this afternoon. She's been documenting Turner's behavior for months, hoping someone would eventually listen. Turns out she's got quite a file of incidents and witnesses." I nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect. What about the other drivers who've had problems?" "Rosa Martinez is eager to talk. So are 3 other drivers who've been dealing with Turner's demands for personal services. They're all scheduled to meet with you individually this afternoon, after we handle the management changes." We walked the 6 blocks to the Metro Transit Authority building through the crisp morning air. The early shift was already in progress, with buses pulling in and out of the depot in the coordinated dance of urban transportation. I watched the drivers and mechanics going about their work with professional competence and felt a surge of pride in what my grandfather had built and what I was now determined to protect. Catherine was waiting for us in the lobby, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the expression of a lawyer who was about to deliver very bad news to people who richly deserved it. She'd brought along Thomas, the notary from the other day, and a security consultant named Mark Stevens who specialized in corporate transitions. Everything's in order, Catherine said quietly as we gathered near the elevators. I've verified that both Hoffman and Turner are in the building. Building security has been briefed, and Mark will be present for both terminations to ensure things proceed smoothly. Mark Stevens was a former police detective who'd transitioned into corporate security. He was a quiet man with observant eyes, who radiated the kind of calm authority that discouraged people from making foolish decisions during stressful situations. The key is to move quickly and professionally, Mark explained as we rode the elevator to the executive floor. We'll handle Hoffman first, then Turner. Both terminations will be effective immediately, with security escort from the building. Their access cards and passwords will be deactivated within the hour. I took a deep breath as the elevator doors opened. Let's do this. Richard Hoffman was in his office reviewing morning reports when Catherine knocked on his door. He looked up with surprise when he saw our group enter, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he noticed Mark Stevens' presence. Mr. Hoffman, Catherine began formally, I'm here representing Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings to inform you that your employment with Metro Transit Authority is terminated effective immediately. The color drained from Hoffman's face. What? On what grounds? You can't just... The termination is for cause, including failure to address employee complaints, mismanagement of company resources, and creating a hostile work environment, Catherine continued, handing him a formal letter. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings under security supervision. Hoffman's shock quickly turned to anger. This is outrageous. I've improved efficiency, reduced costs, increased profitability. You can't terminate me without proper notice or severance. I stepped forward. Mr. Hoffman, I'm Emma Chen, the actual owner of this company. Your employment is terminated because you failed in your fundamental responsibility to treat employees with dignity and respect. There will be no severance package. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to process what was happening. You're the owner? But you're just some woman asking questions about personnel issues. I'm the woman who signs your paychecks, or rather, who used to sign your paychecks. I gestured toward Mark Stevens. Please collect your belongings quickly. Security will escort you from the building. As Hoffman fumbled through his desk drawers, I could see him trying to calculate his options. I'll fight this. I have a contract, legal protections. You can't destroy someone's career based on unfounded allegations. Catherine handed him another document. Your contract allows for immediate termination for cause. The allegations are well documented, and several employees are prepared to testify about your failure to address workplace harassment. I'd strongly advise against pursuing legal action. Mark Stevens maintained his position near the door while Hoffman packed his personal items into a cardboard box. The former general manager's hands were shaking with rage and disbelief as he removed family photos and personal awards from his desk. This is a mistake, Hoffman said as he finished packing. This company needs experienced management, not emotional decisions based on employee gossip. You'll regret this. The only thing I regret is allowing you to mismanage my company for as long as you have, I replied calmly. Please surrender your building access card and company credit cards. Hoffman reluctantly handed over his credentials, then followed Mark Stevens toward the elevator. As they waited for the doors to open, he turned back toward me with undisguised hostility. You have no idea what you're doing. Running a transit system isn't some hobby you can figure out as you go along. This company will fall apart without proper leadership. George stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Richard, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I know the difference between leadership and bullying. Emma's making the right choice. The elevator doors closed on Hoffman's furious expression, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. One problem solved, one more to go. David Turner's office was on the floor below, in the operations department where he supervised route scheduling and driver assignments. Unlike Hoffman's spacious executive suite, Turner's workplace was a cramped office overlooking the garage where buses were serviced and maintained. When we knocked on his door, he looked up from a stack of scheduling reports, with the annoyed expression of someone who didn't like being interrupted. Turner was younger than Hoffman, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that often masked deep insecurity. He was on the phone when we entered, and held up one finger in a gesture that suggested we should wait for him to finish his conversation. "Turner, I need those overtime assignments finalized by noon," he was saying, "and make sure Jennifer understands that her weekend availability affects her scheduling preferences." Catherine stepped forward and spoke clearly. "Mr. Turner, please end your call immediately. We need to speak with you." Turner looked annoyed but concluded his conversation. "What's this about? I'm in the middle of coordinating driver schedules for next week." "Mr. Turner, I'm Catherine Rodriguez, representing Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings. Your employment with Metro Transit Authority is terminated immediately for cause." Turner's reaction was completely different from Hoffman's. Instead of shock, his expression showed calculation and defiance. "Let me guess. Some driver filed another complaint about hurt feelings. Well, I've got news for you. I document everything, and I can prove that every decision I've made has been based on legitimate operational concerns." I watched his body language carefully. Where Hoffman had been genuinely surprised by his termination, Turner seemed to have been expecting something like this. He was prepared to fight. "The termination is based on multiple complaints of sexual harassment, misuse of company resources, and abuse of supervisory authority," Catherine explained, handing him the formal termination letter. Turner barely glanced at the document. "Sexual harassment? That's ridiculous. I treat all my drivers equally, regardless of gender. If some people can't handle professional feedback or understand the demands of the job, that's not harassment. Requiring female drivers to provide personal transportation services for your family members isn't professional feedback," I said, stepping into his line of sight. "It's abuse of power." Turner's eyes narrowed as he focused on me for the first time. "And you are?" "Emma Chen. I own this company." His laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Right. The mysterious owner finally shows up. Let me guess. You've been listening to sob stories from drivers who can't handle real accountability." George moved closer to Turner's desk. "David, I've known you since you started here 6 years ago. You were a decent employee until you got promoted and decided that being a supervisor meant treating people like your personal servants." "Stay out of this, old man. You're retired. Your opinion doesn't matter anymore." Mark Stevens had been quietly observing the interaction, but Turner's aggressive tone prompted him to step forward. "Mr. Turner, you need to collect your personal belongings and leave the building immediately. Security will escort you out." "I'm not going anywhere until I speak with someone who actually has authority here. I want to talk to Richard Hoffman." "Mr. Hoffman was terminated an hour ago," Catherine informed him. "There is no appeal process for termination due to cause." For the first time, Turner's confidence wavered. "Hoffman was fired too?" "The entire management structure is being reorganized," I explained. "Your behavior and his failure to address it have created a hostile work environment that's damaging to both employees and company operations." Turner stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. "This is insane. You can't just come in here and destroy people's careers based on the whining of a few disgruntled employees. I have a mortgage, a family. I've worked here for 6 years. You should have considered those responsibilities before you decided to abuse your position," I replied. "Your actions have consequences, Mr. Turner. Today you're experiencing them." As Turner began gathering his belongings, his anger shifted toward specific threats. "Patricia Wells put you up to this, didn't she? That woman has been causing problems since the day she was hired. She can't handle honest criticism, so she makes up stories about harassment." Mr. Turner, I'd strongly advise you to stop talking, Catherine interjected. Anything you say right now could be used in potential legal proceedings. Legal proceedings? I should be the one filing lawsuits. This is wrongful termination, defamation, destruction of my professional reputation based on lies. Mark Stevens moved closer to Turner's desk. Sir, you need to finish packing and leave the building. Continuing to make accusations against other employees isn't helping your situation. Turner grabbed the few personal items from his desk and shoved them into his briefcase. Unlike Hoffman's methodical packing, Turner's movements were sharp and angry. He knocked over a coffee mug, sending cold coffee spilling across his scheduling reports. You think you're so smart, coming in here? And cleaning house? Turner said as he prepared to leave. But you have no idea how to actually run a transit operation. These drivers need firm management, clear expectations, consequences for poor performance. Without that, this whole system will fall apart. What these drivers need is respect and fair treatment, George responded. Things you never learned, how to provide. As Mark Stevens escorted Turner toward the elevator, the terminated supervisor turned back one final time. This isn't over. I know where the bodies are buried in this company. Financial irregularities, safety violations, union contract breaches. You want to play hardball? I can play harder. The elevator doors closed on Turner's threats, but his words lingered in the air. Catherine made notes on her legal pad while Mark Stevens used his radio to confirm that both terminated employees had left the building. We'll need to review his allegations about financial irregularities, Catherine said. Even if they're baseless, it's better to be prepared. I nodded, but I wasn't particularly concerned about Turner's threats. Desperate people often made wild accusations when their misconduct was exposed. What mattered more was ensuring that the employees he'd mistreated felt safe and supported moving forward. George, are you ready to take over as interim general manager? His weathered face lit up with determination. More than ready. First thing I want to do is call an all-hands meeting for this afternoon. Let everyone know that the old management is gone and that we're committed to running this company the right way. Perfect. Catherine, what do we need to do to make George's appointment official? I have the paperwork right here, she said, pulling documents from her briefcase. George, you'll have full authority to make operational decisions, hire and fire supervisors, and implement policy changes. The appointment is effective immediately. As George signed the documents that made him the new general manager of Metro Transit Authority, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. This wasn't just about punishing people who'd abused their power. It was about creating an environment where dedicated employees could do their jobs without fear of harassment or favoritism. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Emma, we need to talk. This has gone on long enough. Call me. I showed the message to George, who raised an eyebrow. Your husband finally figured out you didn't just disappear into thin air? Apparently, though I'm curious what prompted him to reach out now. It's been 3 days since he dumped me at that bus stop. Maybe someone told him you've been asking questions around town. Word travels fast in a city this size. I considered responding to Marcus's text, then decided against it. Whatever. Conversation we eventually had would happen on my terms, not his. For now, I had more important priorities. The afternoon meetings with Patricia Wells and the other affected employees went exactly as I'd hoped. Patricia turned out to be a thoughtful, professional woman in her 40s who'd been driving for Metro Transit for 8 years. She'd documented Turner's inappropriate behavior meticulously, including dates, times, witnesses, and specific incidents. I never wanted to cause trouble, she explained as we sat in George's new office. I just wanted to do my job and be treated fairly. But when David started requiring certain drivers to run personal errands for management, It became clear that our job security depended on how willing we were to go along with things that weren't in our job descriptions. "What kind of personal errands?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Driving his family members to appointments, picking up his dry cleaning, taking his car for maintenance while we were supposed to be on duty." He made it clear that drivers who were team players would get better routes and more overtime opportunities. Rosa Martinez, the bus driver who'd been so kind to me that first night, had similar stories. David would schedule the drivers he liked for the easy routes with good tips and regular passengers. The rest of us got the difficult routes, split shifts, and minimal overtime. Did anyone ever report this to Hoffman? Several people tried, but David and Richard were friends, and it was clear that complaining would just make things worse for you. David made sure we understood that. As I listened to story after story of professional retaliation and workplace harassment, my anger at the previous management intensified. These were good people who'd been trying to provide essential public services while dealing with supervisors who saw them as personal resources to exploit. "Things are going to be different now," I assured each employee who met with me. "George is going to be implementing new policies that focus on fairness, respect, and professional development. And there will be clear procedures for reporting problems without fear of retaliation." By the end of the day, I'd spoken with 12 employees who'd had negative experiences with Turner's management style. Their stories painted a picture of systematic abuse of power that had created a culture of fear and resentment throughout the operations department. George had spent his first day as general manager reviewing personnel files, meeting with department heads, and beginning the process of restructuring the supervisory hierarchy. When we met for dinner at Sunset Diner, he looked energized despite the long day. "It's amazing how much the atmosphere in that building has changed already," he said over coffee. "People are actually smiling, making eye contact, volunteering ideas for improvement. It's like they can finally breathe again." "Any word from Turner or Hoffman?" Turner called the union representative, trying to file a grievance about his termination. But when the rep heard about the harassment complaints, he basically told Turner he was on his own. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The changes we'd made weren't just about removing problem employees. We were rebuilding a workplace culture based on mutual respect and professional accountability. My phone buzzed again with another message from Marcus. "Emma, people are saying you've been around town asking questions about the transit system. What's going on? We really need to talk." I showed the message to George, who chuckled. "Sounds like word is getting back to him that his abandoned wife isn't as helpless as he thought. What do you think I should do?" "Personally, I think you should let him sweat a little longer. He had no problem leaving you at a bus stop in the rain. Let him wonder what you're up to for a few more days." As we finished our dinner, I reflected on how much had changed in just 4 days. I'd gone from being a discarded wife with no apparent resources to the owner of a multi-million-dollar transportation company who was actively reshaping the lives of dozens of employees. But the most important change wasn't in my external circumstances. It was in how I saw myself. For the first time in years, I felt like the person my grandfather had believed I could become. Someone who used power responsibly, who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, and who understood that real strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Marcus had taught me an important lesson by abandoning me. He'd shown me exactly what kind of person he really was, and in doing so, he'd freed me to become exactly the kind of person I was meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we continued rebuilding Metro Transit Authority's culture and operations. But tonight, I felt more confident and purposeful than I had in years. The woman who'd been left at a bus stop was gone. In her place was someone who owned the bus company and who intended to use that power to make sure no one else was ever abandoned the way she had been. Friday dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. I stood at the window of my hotel suite, watching the morning commuters board the Metro Transit buses with a satisfaction that went deeper than simple ownership. These were my buses, my employees, my responsibility, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the weight and privilege of that accountability. George had called at 6 a.m. with updates from the overnight shift. Word of the management changes had spread through the entire system like wildfire, and the response from employees had been overwhelmingly positive. 3 drivers had already approached him about returning to routes they'd been reassigned from as punishment for refusing Turner's inappropriate requests. The union representative had requested a meeting to discuss restoring proper grievance procedures that had been systematically undermined. But most significantly, George had received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from so soon. Victoria Sterling called the main office last night, George reported over our morning coffee at Sunset Diner. She claimed to be calling on behalf of Marcus Thompson about some kind of business proposal involving Metro Transit contracts. I nearly choked on my coffee. Victoria called about transit contracts? Apparently, she works for Sterling and Associates, and they've been trying to land the advertising account for our bus shelters and digital displays. She wanted to know if the recent management changes affected existing vendor relationships. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus's affair partner was trying to leverage her connection to him to secure a business contract with the company I owned. Neither of them had any idea they were essentially asking me to approve a deal that would benefit the woman my husband had left me for. What did you tell her? I told her that all vendor relationships were under review and that any proposals would need to go through the new ownership structure. She seemed very interested in who the new contacts would be. I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. George, I think it's time to set up a formal vendor presentation. Tell Victoria that Sterling and Associates can present their proposal on Monday afternoon. Make it clear that the decision will be made by the ownership group personally. You want to face her directly? I want to see the look on her face when she realizes exactly who she's been asking to do business with. After breakfast, I drove to Catherine's office to review the progress we'd made in restructuring Metro Transit's operations. The legal aspects of the management changes had been handled flawlessly, but there were larger strategic decisions that needed to be made about the company's future direction. Catherine had prepared a comprehensive analysis of the company's financial position, and the numbers were even better than I'd hoped. The previous management's focus on short-term cost cutting had actually created opportunities for sustainable improvements that would benefit both employees and passengers. The bus replacement program that Hoffman was pushing makes no financial sense, Catherine explained, showing me detailed maintenance projections. The newer buses have significantly lower operational costs and better reliability ratings. Replacing them with older models would increase maintenance expenses by nearly 40% over 5 years. What about expanding service to underserved neighborhoods? Highly feasible. The company's cash flow can support adding 6 new routes without impacting profitability. In fact, increased ridership would likely improve the overall financial picture within 18 months. I studied the route maps Catherine had prepared, noting the areas of Cedar Falls that currently had limited transit access. Most of these were lower-income neighborhoods where residents were most dependent on public transportation. I want to implement the route expansion as soon as possible. Also, I want to review our employee benefit structure. If we're asking people to provide excellent service, we need to compensate them appropriately. Catherine made notes on her legal pad. I'll prepare proposals for both initiatives. There's one other matter we should discuss. I received a call yesterday from a law firm representing David Turner. They're threatening to file a wrongful termination lawsuit unless we agree to a severance package. What's their basis for the claim? They're alleging that the harassment complaints were fabricated and that Turner was terminated without proper due process. They're also claiming that his contract entitled him to 90 days' notice. I considered this development carefully. Turner's threats about knowing where bodies were buried had apparently evolved into actual legal action. But based on the documentation we'd gathered from employees, I was confident we could defend our decision. Counter offer $0 and prepare for litigation. Make sure all the employee statements are properly documented and that our witnesses are prepared to testify if necessary. Very well. I should also mention that Turner's attorney asked specifically about the ownership structure of the company. They seem to be fishing for information about who actually made the termination decision. Let them fish. They'll find out soon enough that their client picked the wrong person to harass. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon visiting various bus routes and talking with drivers who were working under the new management structure. The change in morale was immediately apparent. Drivers were more relaxed, more willing to engage in conversation, and several mentioned specific improvements they'd like to see in equipment or scheduling. Rosa Martinez was particularly enthusiastic when I boarded her afternoon route. Ms. Chen, I can't tell you how different things feel already. George has been asking for our input on route efficiency and passenger safety. It's been years since anyone in management actually listened to the drivers who know these streets best. What changes would make the biggest difference for you and your passengers? Better lighting at some of the evening stops? And maybe digital displays that actually work. Half of our current screens haven't been updated in months because the previous management said maintenance wasn't cost-effective. I made notes about both suggestions. The lighting issue was a safety concern that should be addressed immediately, and the digital displays were part of the advertising contract that Victoria Sterling was apparently hoping to secure. As Rosa's bus approached the Maple Street stop, where Marcus had abandoned me exactly 1 week earlier, I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at his betrayal, satisfaction at how far I'd come, and anticipation for the confrontation that was inevitably approaching. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the day with increasingly urgent messages from Marcus. His tone had shifted from casual requests to talk to barely concealed panic as he apparently began to realize that something significant was happening that he didn't understand. The most recent message was particularly telling. Emma, Helen says someone's been asking questions about us around the neighborhood. People are talking about you being involved in some kind of business deal. I need to know what's going on. This affects both of us. The mention of Helen, Marcus's domineering mother, added another layer of irony to the situation. Helen had never made any secret of her belief that I wasn't good enough for her son, that my background and family connections were somehow inadequate for their social aspirations. Learning that her despised daughter-in-law was actually a significant business owner would be particularly satisfying. I decided it was time to respond to Marcus, but not in the way he expected. Marcus, I texted back, you're right that we need to talk. I'll be at Sterling & Associates on Monday afternoon for a business meeting. Perhaps we can speak afterward. His response came within minutes. Business meeting? What business? Emma, you're scaring me. What's going on? I turned off my phone without responding. Let him spend the weekend wondering. Saturday morning brought an unexpected development. George called to report that Richard Hoffman had been seen at several bars around downtown Cedar Falls, apparently drinking heavily and telling anyone who would listen about his unfair termination. More concerning, he'd been making increasingly specific threats about exposing what he called financial irregularities at Metro Transit. He's claiming that there are millions of dollars in misappropriated federal transit grants, George explained. Says he has documentation that proves the ownership group has been using public money for private purposes. I felt a chill of concern. False accusations could still damage the company's reputation and potentially trigger government investigations. That would be costly and time-consuming, even if we were ultimately cleared. Do we have any vulnerabilities in our federal grant compliance? I've been reviewing all the financial records since Thursday. Everything appears to be properly documented and appropriately used. Hoffman might be referring to some of Turner's creative expense reporting, but that was relatively small amounts, and it's well documented that we terminated both of them for cause. Still, we should be proactive. Can you ask Catherine to initiate an independent audit of our federal grant? Usage? I want to be able to demonstrate complete compliance before Hoffman's accusations gain any traction. Already done. Catherine suggested the same thing yesterday, and she's got an accounting firm starting the review on Monday. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Hoffman's desperation was actually working in our favor. By making wild accusations about financial misconduct, he was undermining his own credibility while giving us the opportunity to demonstrate that our management changes were justified and necessary. Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit my old neighborhood for the first time since Marcus had abandoned me. Riverside Heights was an upscale development of large homes on tree-lined streets, the kind of place where successful professionals went to display their achievements. Marcus and I had bought our house there 5 years ago, when his career was advancing and my grandfather's monthly allowance made the mortgage payments manageable. As I drove slowly through the familiar streets, I found myself seeing the neighborhood differently. The perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars seemed less impressive now that I understood the difference between actual wealth and the appearance of success. Marcus had been so focused on maintaining the image of prosperity that he'd never bothered to understand what real financial security looked like. I parked across the street from our former home, a colonial-style house with a circular driveway and professional landscaping. Marcus's BMW was in the driveway, along with a silver Mercedes that I didn't recognize. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around inside, and I realized that Marcus was entertaining guests. As I watched, the front door opened, and Marcus emerged with a woman I recognized as Victoria Sterling. She was exactly what I'd expected based on her voice during George's phone conversation. Blonde, well-dressed, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to getting what she wanted. Marcus had his arm around her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and performative. They were followed by an older woman who I recognized immediately as Helen Thompson, Marcus's mother. Helen was dressed in her usual expensive but conservative style, and her body language suggested she was thoroughly approving of Marcus's new relationship. The three of them stood on the front porch talking animatedly, clearly comfortable with their domestic arrangement. Watching this scene, I felt a strange sense of detachment. A week ago, seeing Marcus with another woman in our home would have devastated me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew about his character and priorities. He'd moved on so quickly and completely that it was clear our marriage had meant very little to him. But what struck me most was how small their concerns seemed compared to what I'd been dealing with. While I'd been rebuilding a company culture, restoring employee dignity, and making decisions that affected dozens of families, Marcus had been playing house with his new girlfriend and impressing his mother with his ability to upgrade to a more socially acceptable partner. As I drove away from Riverside Heights, I felt the last vestiges of emotional attachment to my old life falling away. Marcus had made his choice, and in doing so, he'd freed me to make mine. Sunday passed quietly as I prepared for the week ahead. Catherine had arranged for the Sterling & Associates presentation to take place at Metro Transit headquarters on Monday at 2 p.m. George would be present as the general manager, along with representatives from our marketing and operations departments. The meeting was structured as a standard vendor presentation, with no indication that I would be personally involved. I spent Sunday evening reviewing Sterling & Associates' marketing materials and business profile. They were a mid-sized firm that specialized in local advertising and promotional campaigns, with several municipal contracts and retail clients. Victoria Sterling was listed as a senior account executive with particular expertise in public sector marketing. What I found most interesting was that their current client roster included several companies that did business with the city of Cedar Falls. If Victoria was successful in landing the Metro Transit contract, it would significantly strengthen Sterling & Associates' position in the local market. The financial incentives for her to succeed were substantial. Marcus had unknowingly put his girlfriend in a position where her professional success depended on securing a contract from the wife he'd abandoned. The irony was almost too perfect. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without being ostentatious. Today would be about demonstrating professional competence and personal strength, not about dramatic revelations or emotional confrontations. George met me at Metro Transit headquarters an hour before the Sterling and Associates presentation. The building felt completely different than it had the week before. Employees moved with more purpose and energy, and the overall atmosphere was one of renewed optimism and professional pride. "Everything's set up in the main conference room," George reported. "Marketing has prepared comparison materials from 3 other advertising firms, and operations has compiled data on our current passenger demographics and route utilization." "Perfect. Have you heard anything more from Hoffman or Turner?" "Turner's been quiet since his attorney sent the demand letter. Hoffman was apparently at Murphy's bar again last night, telling the same stories about financial misconduct. But the independent audit should be completed by Thursday, so we'll have concrete documentation to counter anything he claims." Exactly 2 p.m., Victoria Sterling arrived at Metro Transit headquarters, accompanied by 2 colleagues and carrying presentation materials that suggested they'd prepared extensively for this meeting. She was dressed in an expensive business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who expected to win the contract. George greeted them in the lobby and escorted them to the conference room, where the Metro Transit team was waiting. I remained in George's office, watching through the window that overlooked the conference room. Victoria had no idea that the owner of the company was observing her every move. The presentation began promptly, with Victoria taking the lead in explaining Sterling and Associates' approach to transit advertising. Her materials were professional and well-prepared, focusing on digital displays, bus shelter advertising, and promotional campaigns designed to increase ridership. "Our research indicates that Metro Transit has significant untapped potential in the Cedar Falls market," Victoria explained to the assembled group. "With the right advertising strategy, we believe we can increase ridership by 15% within the first year." Her colleagues provided supporting data about successful campaigns they'd managed for other transit systems, and their financial projections showed reasonable expectations for both advertising revenue and passenger growth. What I found most telling was Victoria's obvious confidence that she would win the contract. Her presentation style suggested someone who was accustomed to success and who expected this to be a formality rather than a competitive process. After 45 minutes of presentation, George thanked the Sterling and Associates team and explained that the decision would be made by the ownership group within the next few days. Victoria immediately asked about meeting directly with the decision-makers. "The ownership structure of Metro Transit has recently changed," George explained carefully. "The new owner prefers to review vendor presentations privately before making final decisions." "Is there any way we could arrange a brief meeting?" Victoria pressed. "I think it would be beneficial for us to explain our vision directly to whoever will be making this decision." George glanced toward his office window, where I was still observing. We'd anticipated this request, and I nodded slightly to indicate I was ready for the next phase. "Actually," George said, "the owner happens to be available now. If you'd like to wait a few minutes, I can see if she's willing to meet with you briefly." Victoria's expression shifted to one of increased attention. Yes, the owner is a woman, very hands-on in her approach to business operations. I think you'll find her quite impressive." As George left the conference room to check on the owner's availability, I could see Victoria conferring quietly with her colleagues. This wasn't what they'd expected, and I could tell they were recalibrating their approach. 5 minutes later, George returned to escort the Sterling and Associates team to his office for what they believed would be a brief meeting with the mysterious owner of Metro Transit Authority. I was seated behind George's desk when they entered, having arranged myself to project calm authority. Victoria walked in first, her hand extended for an introduction, her professional smile bright and confident. "Ms. Sterling, I presume," I said, standing to shake her hand. "I'm Emma Chen, owner of Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings." The transformation in Victoria's expression was immediate and spectacular. Her confident smile faltered. Her outstretched hand trembled slightly, and the color drained from her face as she realized exactly who she was looking at. "Emma?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ms. Chen," I corrected gently. "Thank you for coming in today. I understand you have a proposal for our advertising contracts." Victoria's colleagues looked confused by her obvious distress, but she managed to regain some composure. I had no idea that you were This Is Your Company." "Yes, it is. My grandfather built Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings, and I inherited it recently. We're always interested in working with qualified vendors who can help us serve our community effectively." I gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of the desk. "Please, have a seat. I'd love to hear more about your vision for Metro Transit's advertising strategy." As Victoria sank into her chair, I could see her mind racing to process the implications of this revelation. The woman her boyfriend had abandoned at a bus stop was actually the owner of a multi-million-dollar company that her firm desperately wanted to do business with. The next 20 minutes would determine not just the outcome of a business contract, but the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape several lives in ways that none of them had anticipated. Victoria Sterling sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, her professional composure completely shattered. Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly sensing the tension but unable to understand its source. The confident woman who had walked into my office expecting to close a lucrative deal had been replaced by someone who looked like she was facing her worst nightmare. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Victoria finally managed, her voice strained. "Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting when you've had time to review our materials more thoroughly." I leaned back in my chair, maintaining perfect composure while savoring every second of her discomfort. "Oh, I don't think there's any misunderstanding at all, Ms. Sterling. You're here representing Sterling and Associates, seeking a contract for Metro Transit's advertising programs. I'm the owner of Metro Transit, considering whether your firm is the right fit for our needs." "But you're Marcus's wife," she whispered, apparently forgetting that her colleagues had no context for this revelation. "Estranged wife, actually. Marcus made that quite clear when he left me at a bus stop last Monday evening. I believe he mentioned something about discussing your future together over dinner that night." Victoria's face went from pale to bright red as she realized how much I knew about her relationship with my husband. One of her colleagues, a middle-aged man with a briefcase full of marketing analytics, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should focus on the business proposal," he suggested, clearly hoping to salvage what was rapidly becoming a disaster. "Excellent idea," I agreed. "Ms. Sterling, you mentioned that Sterling and Associates believes Metro Transit has untapped potential. I'm curious about your research methodology. How did you identify the opportunities you're proposing to address?" Victoria struggled to regain her professional footing. "We conducted market analysis of ridership patterns, demographic studies of potential passengers, and competitive assessments of advertising effectiveness in similar markets." "Fascinating. And how long did this research take?" "Approximately 6 weeks. I nodded thoughtfully. 6 weeks. That's interesting timing. According to my records, Sterling and Associates only requested information about our advertising contracts 7 weeks ago. So you began your market research before you even knew if we were accepting proposals." The implication hung in the air, like smoke. Victoria had begun pursuing Metro Transit as a client at exactly the same time her relationship with Marcus had intensified. It wasn't difficult to connect those dots. "Ms. Sterling," I continued, "I have to wonder if your interest in our advertising contracts might be influenced by factors beyond pure business considerations." Her colleague looked increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting veered further from standard vendor presentations into what was clearly personal territory. "Mrs. Chen, I think there might be some confusion here. Victoria's professional recommendations are always based solely on market analysis and client needs. Ms. Chen, I corrected gently. And I'm sure Ms. Sterling's professional integrity is usually beyond question. But in this particular case, I'm concerned about potential conflicts of interest. Victoria found her voice again, though it trembled slightly. I don't understand what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Ms. Sterling. I'm stating directly that your romantic relationship with my husband represents a significant conflict of interest in any business relationship between our companies. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's colleagues stared at her in shock, clearly having no idea about her personal involvement with a client's family member. In the corporate world, such relationships represented serious ethical violations that could destroy professional reputations. I think we should end this meeting, Victoria said, standing abruptly. There are obviously personal issues here that make it impossible to have a productive business discussion. Please sit down, I said calmly. We're not finished yet. Something in my tone made Victoria hesitate. She remained standing, but she didn't leave. You see, Ms. Sterling, this meeting isn't really about advertising contracts at all. It's about consequences. For the past 6 months, you've been having an affair with my husband. Last Monday, he abandoned me at a bus stop in the rain because he wanted to spend the evening discussing your future together. He took our savings, emptied our joint accounts, and moved you into our home while I had nowhere to go. Victoria's colleagues were now staring at her with undisguised horror. Corporate ethics violations were serious business, and being involved in the destruction of a client's marriage could end careers. You both assumed I was powerless, I continued. A discarded wife with no resources, no connections, no ability to affect your lives in any meaningful way. You calculated that the benefits of your relationship outweighed any potential consequences, because what could I possibly do to hurt either of you? I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the metro transit depot, where buses were arriving and departing in the efficient choreography of public transportation. Marcus saw me as a dependent spouse whose primary value was making him look respectable at social functions. You saw me as an obstacle to be removed so you could claim the life you wanted. Neither of you bothered to consider who I actually was or what I might be capable of. Turning back to face Victoria, I smiled with genuine satisfaction. Sterling and Associates will not be receiving the Metro Transit advertising contract. In fact, I'll be sending letters to every municipal agency in Cedar Falls informing them that your firm employs an account executive who conducts personal relationships with family members of potential clients. I suspect that will significantly impact your ability to secure public sector contracts in the future. Victoria's face crumpled as the full implications of her situation became clear. You can't destroy my career because of personal issues between you and Marcus. I'm not destroying your career because of personal issues, Ms. Sterling. I'm protecting my company from potential legal and ethical complications that could arise from doing business with a firm that doesn't maintain appropriate professional boundaries. It's simply good business practice. Her colleague, who had been trying to salvage the meeting, finally spoke up. Ms. Chen, surely we can find a way to resolve this professionally. Victoria's personal life shouldn't affect Sterling and Associates' ability to serve your company's needs. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Which is why I'll be happy to consider proposals from Sterling and Associates once Ms. Sterling is no longer associated with your firm. Personal conflicts of interest are incompatible with professional relationships. The man's expression shifted as he realized what I was suggesting. You're asking us to terminate Victoria's employment. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm simply explaining the conditions under which I might consider doing business with your firm in the future. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it was filled with desperate anger. This is vindictive and unprofessional. You're using your business position to settle personal scores. Actually, Ms. Sterling, I'm using my business position to ensure that my company maintains the highest standards of professional integrity, something you might want to consider for your own career. I walked back to my desk and picked up Victoria's business proposal. Your market analysis was quite thorough, actually. The demographic studies were particularly insightful. It's unfortunate that your ethical standards don't match your research capabilities. As I spoke, my office door opened and Marcus walked in, his face flushed with exertion and obvious panic. He'd apparently run from the parking lot, and his usually perfect appearance was disheveled and sweaty. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw Victoria and her colleagues. "Victoria? What are you doing here?" The tableau was perfect. Marcus standing in the doorway in obvious distress, Victoria looking mortified at being caught in professional disgrace, her colleagues realizing they were witnessing a personal drama that could destroy their firm's reputation, and me, calmly, observing the convergence of consequences I'd orchestrated. "Hello, Marcus," I said pleasantly. Ms. Sterling was just presenting a proposal for Metro Transit's advertising contracts. Unfortunately, we've determined that Sterling and Associates doesn't meet our standards for vendor relationships. Marcus looked confused and increasingly desperate. "Metro Transit? Emma, what does any of this have to do with you?" "Everything, actually. I own Metro Transit Authority. I own the entire Pacific Northwest Transportation Holdings Company that includes transit systems in 6 cities. The mysterious ownership group that everyone's been wondering about? That's me." Marcus stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. Your grandfather's inheritance was just a small trust fund. Clearly, you didn't pay very close attention to the details of my family's financial situation. My grandfather built a substantial business empire, and I inherited it when I turned 35 last month. You might remember that birthday. Marcus, we celebrated at that expensive restaurant where you kept checking your phone to read text messages from Victoria." The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications began to register. "You own a transportation company?" "I own several transportation companies, along with real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and various other assets. The monthly allowance you always dismissed as family money was actually just a small portion of the trust distributions. The real wealth was always there, waiting for me to be old enough to manage it responsibly." Victoria's colleague had been frantically taking notes during this exchange, apparently trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his firm. "Ms. Chen, I think we should schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss this situation more appropriately." "There won't be any follow-up meetings," I replied. Sterling and Associates had an opportunity to present their proposal professionally, and instead I've discovered serious ethical violations that make any business relationship impossible. Marcus stepped further into the office, his desperation becoming more obvious. "Emma, we need to talk privately. There are things you don't understand about Victoria and me." "Actually, I understand everything perfectly. You abandoned your wife because you thought she was financially dependent and professionally powerless. You moved your girlfriend into our home and spent our savings on romantic vacations because you assumed I had no recourse. You both calculated that I was someone whose feelings and future could be sacrificed for your convenience." I walked around the desk to stand directly in front of Marcus. "But here's what you didn't calculate. Darling, I'm not the helpless, dependent woman you thought you married. I'm a business owner with substantial resources and the willingness to use them to protect my interests. Emma, please, let's discuss this rationally. We can work something out. That's fair to everyone." "We already have worked something out, Marcus. You wanted your freedom to pursue a relationship with Victoria, and I've given you that freedom. The divorce papers were filed this morning, along with financial disclosures that I think will surprise you quite a bit." Marcus's face went white. "Divorce papers?" "Catherine Rodriguez handled everything. You'll be served later today. I'm not seeking any support or shared assets from you, of course. I don't need your money. But I am claiming the house in Riverside Heights, which is actually titled to one of my family's holding companies. You'll need to find alternative housing arrangements." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "The house is yours?" "The house was always mine. The mortgage, Payments came from my trust distributions, and the title was structured to protect the asset. You've been living in my house for 5 years, Marcus. I hope you and Victoria enjoyed it. Victoria had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, and she finally exploded. This is insane. You can't just destroy people's lives because your marriage didn't work out. I turned to face her with cool composure. Ms. Sterling, I'm not destroying anyone's life. I'm simply choosing not to subsidize the people who betrayed me. Marcus is free to pursue his relationship with you, and you're free to rebuild your career after the ethical violations are addressed. But you'll both be doing it without my financial support or business connections. What ethical violations? Marcus demanded. Victoria didn't do anything wrong. Victoria pursued a business relationship with my company while conducting an affair with my husband. That represents a massive conflict of interest that could expose Metro Transit to legal liability. No responsible business owner would ignore such obvious ethical problems. George knocked on the office door and entered with perfect timing. Emma, your 3 o'clock meeting is here. Should I ask them to wait? No, we're just finishing up. Here. I turned back to Victoria and her colleagues. Gentlemen, Ms. Sterling, thank you for your time today. George will escort you to the lobby. As the Sterling and Associates team prepared to leave, Victoria made one final attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Emma, if you change your mind about working with our firm, please know that we're committed to the highest standards of professional service. I appreciate that, Ms. Sterling. Should your employment situation change, I'll certainly consider Sterling and Associates for future projects. The message was unmistakable. Victoria's career with the firm was over, and everyone in the room knew it. After George escorted the business delegation out, Marcus remained in my office, looking lost and desperate. Emma, I know I handled things badly, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through our problems. Marcus, there's nothing to fix. You made your choice when you left me at that bus stop. I've simply made mine. But I didn't know about your money, your companies. If I'd understood your financial situation, things would have been different. I stared at him in amazement. You think this is about money? Well, obviously your resources change the equation. We could have a completely different kind of marriage, with better opportunities, social connections. Marcus, you're missing the point entirely. This isn't about my money. It's about the fact that when you thought I was powerless, you abandoned me without a second thought. When you believed I was financially dependent, you took our savings and spent them on another woman. The money didn't change who I am. It just revealed who you are. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. The divorce will be finalized within 60 days. Catherine will handle all the legal details. You'll need to be out of the house by the end of the week. Emma, wait, please. We've been together for 8 years. That has to mean something. I paused at the door and looked back at him. It does mean something, Marcus. It means I wasted 8 years of my life with someone who saw me as a convenience rather than a partner. But it also means I'm free now to build the kind of life I actually want. What about Victoria's job? Her career? You're destroying her future over something that was really my fault. Victoria made her own choices, just like you did. She pursued a married man and then tried to profit professionally from that relationship. The consequences are hers to deal with. I left Marcus standing alone in my office and walked to the elevator. Through the building's windows, I could see the afternoon shift change in progress at the bus depot. Drivers were ending their routes, mechanics were performing routine maintenance, and dispatchers were coordinating the evening schedules. All of these people were doing their jobs with the professionalism and dedication that made public transportation possible. These were my employees now, my responsibility, and my opportunity to create something meaningful. Unlike Marcus and Victoria, who saw relationships and business dealings as opportunities for personal advancement, I had the chance to build something that actually served a greater purpose. George met me in the lobby as I was preparing to leave. How did it go with Marcus? Exactly as expected. He's still trying to calculate how my money changes his options, rather than understanding that his character was the real problem. And Victoria? I suspect Sterling and Associates will be making some personnel changes very soon. Word travels fast in the business community, and ethics violations tend to have long-lasting consequences. As I drove away from Metro Transit headquarters, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had been abandoned at a bus stop 9 days ago no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who had the resources to protect herself and others, and who wasn't afraid to use her power responsibly. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This is Victoria. Can we talk privately? I think there's been a misunderstanding. I deleted the message without responding. There hadn't been any misunderstanding. There had simply been consequences. That evening, I had dinner at Sunset Diner with George and Rosa Martinez, who had become my informal advisors on Metro Transit operations. We discussed expansion plans, employee benefit improvements, and the digital display upgrades that would actually serve passengers rather than generate questionable advertising revenue. You know, Rosa said over coffee, it's funny how things work out sometimes. A week ago, you were just someone having the worst night of her life. Now you're giving all of us the chance to have the best jobs of our careers. Sometimes the worst. Things that happen to us create opportunities for the best things, I replied. Marcus thought he was discarding someone who couldn't survive without him. Instead, he freed someone who could thrive beyond his imagination. George raised his coffee cup in a toast to unexpected beginnings and well-deserved endings. As we clinked cups together, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. A week ago, I had been an abandoned wife with no apparent options. Tonight, I was a business owner with the resources and determination to create positive change in dozens of lives. Marcus and Victoria would have to find their own way forward, dealing with the consequences of choices they'd made when they thought those choices would never matter. Meanwhile, I had a transportation empire to run, employees to support, and a future to build that was entirely my own. The rain had finally stopped in Cedar Falls, and for the first time in years, everything seemed possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.